Good afternoon. I am Sarah Rennie. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. I've been in the field 20 some years. I try to keep that 20 pretty loose because it's getting up there. And I began my work in homeless intervention. I actually ran a homeless shelter and then moved to domestic violence and sexual assault. And so we want to bring you some of the things that cross over into sort of work with domestic violence and sexual assault, as well as which works generally around the neurobiology of trauma. One of the most important things to note is that I am a lot of work with the VI and coordinated entry. So a lot of this is specifically around how we ask questions and in what manner we ask questions as we look at coordinated entry. I'll let Dr. Jessica Adel introduce herself.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. As Sarah said, my name is Jessica Adel. I use pronouns she, her, and hers. I am with the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence as well, and I am an evaluator and program director. Similar to Sarah, I started my work also in the homeless sector. I ran a homeless organization in South Mid-Michigan area and was also the chair of the continuum of care for that region. I've written more than I want to count, had admissions grants, was around at the very beginning of the VI SPDAT as well. And have been in this movement for slightly under 20 years. And then again, similar to Sarah, also now work in the domestic and sexual violence movement. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jessica.
So during our time today, over our 90 minutes or so, we're going to be covering a little bit of an overview of trauma-informed care. So for those of you that were able to attend live or watch the video from part one, that talked in depth about the neurobiology of trauma and how it applies to the homeless sector and to the homeless services. And so in part two, we're gonna revisit some of the key principles. And then we're also going to talk a little more practically about how to integrate trauma-informed care into your organizations. Because of the way this is set up today, my understanding is we will not be able to share out verbally, but Sarah and I do really encourage you to be as interactive as you can through the chat feature. And we have a couple people monitoring this, and we are happy to share that out. And if you would prefer to message me, you can direct message me if you would like, and I can share it out anonymously as well.
Thank you, Jessica. We are fast talkers and we have a lot to cover, but do not hesitate to put in questions in the chat. And we're going to move forward into the substance of our training today. Jessica?
Yeah, fast talkers is an understatement, Sarah. We're also going to try to practice our best practices in online training, and remember once in a while to give folks a 30-second break just so you can gather your thoughts. Some people might be translating into other languages, and give you a moment just to ask some questions. So one of the things we like to cover from the get-go is a little bit of an overview of what we mean by trauma-informed care. You'll recognize this as a slide that we did talk about in part one as well. There's a significant amount of folks joining us today that were not able to view that video. And so we do want to just go over really quickly what we mean when we're talking about trauma-informed care. So this is not an exhaustive list. And we're going to go into a lot more detail on all of these points as we move through this section. But when we think about trauma-informed care, one of the biggest things we talk about is safety. And with safety, it's not just physical safety or the way that we typically safety plan with clients, but also all aspects of safety. So emotional safety, spiritual safety, safety within individuals' identities, that clients can show up as whole people with their lived experiences and everything that they've been through before walking into the door and when they're sitting in front of you as an advocate. Trust. So creating an environment that's based in truth and honesty. So as an advocate or whatever role you have within your organization, making sure that you're doing what you say you're going to do. So we're establishing guideposts for our work together, assisting in creating plans and goals with the client themselves. Choice. So we are giving options and informed options of all of the different programs and things that clients can engage in while they're with us, and then letting that client choose. We're being collaborative with other agencies, and we're going to talk a lot about that towards the end of this, on how we can collaborate with other systems and engage in higher level systems change work. We always operate from an empowerment standpoint. So we are actively trying to identify and recognize resiliency and strength within the individual who's experiencing homelessness, and then building upon that strength. And then we're always acting from an intersectional lens. And we're going to revisit that intersectional diagram in a few moments.
Thank you, Jessica. So this video is going to give us a little basic review of the neurobiology of trauma, specifically around sexual assault victims. But I want to remind everyone that trauma is a human condition. Unfortunately, everyone on this call, whether you've had a loved one pass away, been sick, had a burglary, has experienced trauma. So this information that you're going to get from Dr. Rebecca Campbell will apply to specifically your homeless clients as well, particularly because studies have shown that being homeless is itself a traumatic event. Allison? Uh-oh.
Sorry, everyone. Jessica had trouble during our tech check as well. One sec, I will fix it.
It always seems to happen that things work beautifully during the tech check. And then when you actually go live, you run into issues. So this is a great opportunity to have a 30-second pause. If anybody has any questions at this time, feel free to put them into chat.
Just going to be playing it off of YouTube because that we got that to work earlier.
So during a traumatic situation, there are two basic neurobiological processes that we're interested in looking at. One is what hormones are released and how does that affect behavior during the assault and the immediate aftermath of the assault. And then what is happening with respect to the memory of that traumatic event. Most survivors are going to have one of four main stress chemicals released in their bodies, or some have multiple hormones and chemicals released at the time of the assault. One of which are going to be the catecholamines. Catecholamines are like natural adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up in a traumatic or stressful situation that would help a survivor be able to fight back against the attacker or try to flee from the situation. Another hormone that's often released for survivors during an assault are the corticosteroids. And those work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy is available. So again, for some survivors, they have a lot of energy available to fight back and to flee, and they stay very pumped up after the assault. But some don't. It sort of bottoms out and flattens out on them, and they might freeze during the assault, or they might be in kind of a stupor almost after the assault. Other hormones that affect the behavior at the time of the assault are opiates, which is like natural morphine. So some survivors during the assault report feeling like they're almost drugged, that they're out of it. And then when they do first responder interviews later, they have no affect. They're just describing it with no emotion, no affect, like they're reading out of the TV guide. There's just nothing to them. That's the opiates. The opiates help block physical pain, which you need during a traumatic situation, but they also just keep blunting everything. Okay. The other hormone that's sometimes released is oxytocin. And this is a hormone that promotes good feelings. Okay. And that may sound strange. Why would you have a hormone that's about good feelings released during a sexual assault? Again, it's about trying to block the pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain. So the body will release opiates, natural morphine, to try to tamp down the physical pain. And sometimes it will release oxytocin in conjunction with that to try to balance it out. Hormone that promotes good feelings, hormone that tries to blunt pain. Again, it's just trying to mitigate the pain of this assault. But if the oxytocin levels get a little high, sometimes survivors might laugh, giggle, smile, engage in socially appropriate behavior that's socially inappropriate given that situation. So those are the 4 hormones that can affect the behavior during the assault. And these hormones are really instrumental in blocking the physical pain, helping the body react to the trauma of the assault. Now, here's the kicker. Those 4 hormones, very helpful in so many ways. When those 4 hormone levels are very high in the body, it interferes with other structures in your brain that are trying to lay down the neural mechanisms of the memory. So it's one of those times where our body's kind of working at cross purposes. Those hormones are really helpful for fight, for flight, for mitigating the pain, but they cause cellular damage in 2 key structures of our brain that work to lay down a memory. What we've learned from the neurobiology of trauma research is that the memories of traumatic events are stored in a very disorganized way. When a survivor sits down and tries to explain to either a responding officer or detective what happened in the assault, and it starts coming out in this bits and pieces, fragmented way of they start one thing, but then they stop abruptly and then they start talking about something else, or they start explaining it very generally and then they start throwing in random details. It can be very confusing for law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement, based on other training they've had, will look at that and say, this looks suspicious to me because it seems like they're making it up as they're going along. They're not making it up as they're going along. They're having difficulty recalling the different pieces of the assault because of the way the trauma of the assault affected the way the memory is laid down. So for law enforcement, they see this completely disorganized, discombobulated presentation and they say, I'm not believing this. This seems made up to me. What they're really seeing is evidence of trauma. What they're really seeing is how trauma impacts memory formation and then memory recall. So I think it's important for law enforcement to keep in mind that when they see that really confusing stop, start, disorganized presentation, to think about that what they're seeing is trauma. What they're seeing is a survivor trying to reach into the different pieces and parts of their brain and all the different fragments of that memory, and they're doing their best to put it together and to give it back. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memory is intact. So even though the storage is fragmented and can come out kind of sounding confusing and in bits and pieces, the actual recall, accurate. One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things, okay? Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk, because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual, obviously misfiled. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk, 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.
Thank you. So if we can go back to the PowerPoint, we're going to talk about how that sort of short synopsis of your brain, for lack of a better word, the effects of trauma on the brain affects our work in homelessness. So one of the things that's really important to understand is that, as Dr. Campbell expressed, people respond differently to trauma based on their bodies, based on their experiences, based on their prior traumatic experiences. And this is true of any trauma, including homelessness, domestic violence, and sexual assault. So I want you to think that you're the client. And the idea is we're going to join the client in this bubble. Now, this is specifically for domestic violence or sexual assault victims, but it could be anyone with a co-occurring, mental health diagnosis and drug addiction, or any of your clients. It would just be different arrows. You can hit the button. Keep hitting it. So what your client is dealing with are all of these systems. They may be dealing with immigration, schools. We know they're almost always dealing with schools. They're dealing with medical services, community services. They're trying to get a job. Often they have friend of the court. Often they have child protective service. If they're seeing you, they have housing issues. There's also civil and criminal law issues. And I want you to imagine that with all of the challenges that affect the brain in the neurobiology of trauma as described by Dr. Campbell. Next slide. Compounding that, I also want you to imagine that this is the little guy we use for intersectionality, that your identity is one that perhaps views systems with suspicion because there's historical trauma, that you're poor, so you may not have access to things that other folks have access to, that you have, that you're a senior, and there's no accessible housing around for you because you need specifically help in the activities of daily living. What this does is show you the layers of how your identity, as well as the systems plus trauma, create significant barriers to supports for folks who are homeless. And it's our job as advocates for folks who support those who are homeless to help to understand this and help, one, not do no harm and create as little barriers as possible, but hopefully actively create solutions as well. So we're going to talk, I'm going to pause there for 30 seconds and see if Jessica has anything she wants to weigh in before I go into this next section. Both for Jessica or for anyone who has any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, and when we're looking at this intersectionality slide, so Sarah mentioned that each one of these identities or the compounding effects of these identities, so the experience, the lived experience of the person that's experiencing homelessness that's coming in for services, they can create barriers in all of, in that, you don't have to move to this before, but thinking about that previous slide, they can create barriers or different interactions with all of those systems. And although that image was created to be used with domestic and sexual violence, in my experience working with families and people experiencing homelessness, most of the clients that we worked with at our organization were involved in most of, if not all of those systems. It was very unusual for somebody to come in that is only dealing with homelessness, because homelessness is it's a complicated, multi-layered issue that involves other things, right? And so these different identities and lived experiences that people hold also bring in resiliencies and strengths And so we're going to talk later about how we can also build upon the resiliencies that people come in with as well.
I would also add, and I asked my staff to print this out. So if you don't have it, you should print it to remind yourself of all of these folks' identities. I would also add that studies have shown that if you get 2 or more of these intersections, so education and race, immigration status and education, or immigration status and income, our systems have a really hard time navigating and accommodating folks with more than one intersection. And we will definitely make sure you get a copy of the PowerPoint so you can print this out, because we really encourage folks. We put it on our door to remind ourselves that we don't know what people's lives have been, what they're experiencing. Many of these things are not things we should make assumptions about. In fact, none of them are. And we really should realize, as we do trauma-informed work, that there are layers to the trauma, whether it's historical trauma because of the nature of the ways in which systems have affected a group of folks, such as Black folks who have historically been overrepresented in our criminal justice system, whether it's poverty and there's no access to dollars. All of those things, we have to be reminded, because we see maybe 20 people, at a time, or 10 people a day. All of these people come with this trauma layered individually. So every file folder, and this shows I'm old because it's probably a desktop folder now, is a person. And it's really important that we remember that these folks that are in front of us are facing this, the criminal piece, and then the biological effects of trauma. So one of the questions, so we did this quickly because we covered this in depth in the first training, and I encourage you to access that, because the next question we got was, okay, so what is it that we should do around once we understand this, how do we change our work? So one of the things we've been looking at with the VI, as well as all coordinated entries, there's 2 parts. There's a lot of research that the VI perhaps hasn't lived up to its potential and has a ton of implicit bias. But there's also the part of whatever tool we use has to be trauma-informed, and we have to address implicit bias. This training will not be the VI SPDAT. Sorry, for those who don't know, the VI SPDAT is a tool that is used essentially to help place people in appropriate housing. It's a vulnerability index. Thank you. And one of the things that we have learned, and when you know better, you do better, because I want to be very clear, the VI was a step forward from where we were. And now we are learning more. And so the next question is, how do we do those anytime we are screening someone? So for those of you who do not use the VI SPDAT for vulnerability index, but do intake, for those of you who sit down, I find myself talking, whenever you're talking to someone, you know that they're in trauma. So what we're going to talk about next is create a better framework for navigating folks in trauma. Jessica?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I'm glad, I really loved what you just said, when you know better, you do better. And, this is usually something that I kind of say at the beginning of these presentations. Whenever we're learning about how to be trauma-informed, I know I'll speak from my own experience. When I first started working in this field, I was not very trauma-informed, and I didn't understand it that well. And the more that I learned about it, the more I had this response of, like, I've been doing everything wrong, or nothing, like everything I'm learning sounds great, but in reality, in real life, working in a shelter with funding restrictions and limited staff and all of the things that we're all dealing with, this just isn't possible. And I often had a lot of negative feelings and guilt feelings, and that is all really normal. And so I really want to normalize that reaction. And as we're going through this next hour and talking about a different approach to the work that we're doing, I really want to normalize that when we learn new information, it can cause some of these reactions, and that's all totally fine. Sarah and I have both been working in the field, not just in the coalition here where we're like doing research and training and things like that, but working in the field, sitting across the desk from folks experiencing homelessness and survivors. We understand those restrictions and things that make our work more difficult. So we're talking about best practices, and there are different ways that you can come closer to best practices. And it's totally normal to find out that a best practice maybe isn't the way that we've been doing things, and that's okay, because now is a time where we can start thinking about how to shift our organizations to start doing things in a more trauma-informed way.
Thank you, Jessica.
Allison?
So one of the things I want to advocate, I'm going to talk about, call this the cycle of mistrust. And it says advocate interviewer approaches the case with skepticism. It doesn't even have to be skepticism. It could be a flat affect. It could be sort of a routine and that it feels like skepticism to someone in trauma. So someone in trauma then senses that they're a number, or that you're not hearing their pain. They feel defensive and they stop cooperating. Then the client becomes frustrated, and it's sort of one of those, there's a term for it in research, something bias, Jessica, but essentially it's our own biases that you become frustrated, you come in nervous, and you say, I knew, confirmation bias, thank you. I knew it was bogus, and the client believes it was all a waste of time, and then the skepticism is reinforced, and the advocate is like, I can't get people to cooperate. There aren't enough people who will sit still long enough to do my screening tool. And it creates this circle where we're not able to help folks where they're at, and folks aren't feeling increasingly re-victimized by the structure of our systems. Jessica?
Yeah, again, so I think back to, I always like to tie in like make it feel personal and tie in real world examples. And I think back to lots of mistakes that I've made over the past 2 decades. And one of them being, you know, when Sarah was talking about approaching with skepticism, and for me, it wasn't skepticism, but it was sort of like a hyper professional business attitude of sitting down with my intake, like, okay, answer the question. That's not trauma informed, and it's re-victimizing, and it can make people feel like I wasn't really listening to them. That wasn't my intention, of course, but intention and impact are very different things. Allison?
And just a little bit of role playing, which I didn't tell Jessica I was going to do. But if I approach Jessica and I say, good morning, Miss Adel, how are you this morning?
Fine.
What brings you in today?
I need to get shelter.
Oh, okay. Do you have any medical conditions?
No, I'm pretty much fine.
Are you HIV positive?
What?
I asked you a question, and I need to fill out this information for my vulnerability index. I just need you to cooperate with me.
So this is one of those moments where I wish I had like thought bubbles that you could see, because they have to be censored. Second of all, in my head, I'm thinking, if I am HIV positive, if I tell that to you, does that mean that I'm going to qualify? I'm like more apt to qualify for services? Or does that mean that you're going to get all weird and squeamish because we're still totally uncomfortable with HIV in 2021, or that I'm going to be disqualified for services? And that whole experience did not feel good. And it's not just because it was an impromptu role play.
Right. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the questions are pretty flat and you're trying to get through them. And that's true of our client intakes for DVSA, that we're going to talk about ways to ask those questions differently. So thank you, Jess, for the impromptu role play. I just want to give an example of how off-putting sometimes we are to folks without really knowing we're being off-putting. You know, you're sipping your tea. I just pulled you in from drinking your tea and you're like, what the actual heck is going on right now? So what do we want to do instead? We want to build trust. Good morning, Miss Idle. How are you today? I'm very much excited to be able to help you. And what I'd like to do is to ask you a few questions. Those questions will help me understand better how to help you. If at any time you're uncomfortable, you don't have to answer those, and you can ask me at any time why I'm asking. Provide support service. Some of these things are really hard, and I know you're going through a lot. We're going to work out some ways that I might be able to provide referrals for you and see if there's anything further we can do. And just know that, if anything occurs to you, you can always let us know. This is our conversation. We're going to go where the conversation leads.
So I love the way that you phrase that, Sarah. When we think about how we do intakes, I think as an industry, we often forget that we are gatekeepers. Like, we think that other systems are gatekeepers, but we are the ones who want to provide the services. In reality, the client experience can be that we're gatekeepers. And honestly, we are, because we decide if that person comes into shelter, if they go into rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, what things in our organization that we have, that person gets to have access to. So we do gatekeep. And one of the things that we do is we, in our minds or on paper, we have a list of eligibility criteria. And it's like a client has to say the magic words to get those services, to get access to certain things. I can't tell you how many times I had conversations with advocates where I was told, like, well, they didn't actually say this, like they didn't say that magic word. So we're going to do this next sketch. It's just kind of a funny thing. It's only about 2 minutes long. This is actually a Monty Python sketch where he is talking about, he's trying to report a burglary to the police. So it's a funny thing, but just think about how clients may experience our systems. And then when clients change the way that they respond to questions or respond to the caseworker, the case manager, to get their needs met, sometimes we label them as like manipulators, frequent flyers. We use all of those words that that are not trauma informed, right? Okay, Allison.
Good evening. I wish to report a burglary. Speak up, please, sir. I wish to report a burglary. I can't hear you, sir. I wish to report a burglary! That's a little bit too loud, sir. Could you say it just a little less loud than that? I wish to report a burglary. No, I'm still not getting anything. Could you try it in a higher register? What do you mean, a higher register? What? I wish to report a burglary! Oh, that's it. Hang on a moment. No, a little bit louder. I wish to report a burglary! What? That's the exact frequency. Now keep it up. Hello, Sarge! Evening, Jordan. Well, I'm afraid I'm going off duty now, sir. Could you tell Sergeant Foster? Excuse me, sir, but why the funny voice? Serious, I just got used to talking like that to the other sergeant. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I can't hear you, sir. Could you try speaking in a lower register? I wish to report the loss of £5,000. £5,000? That's serious. You'd better speak to the detective inspector. What seems to be the trouble, Sergeant? Well, this gentleman, sir, just come in to report that he was sitting out with a friend when he heard a noise in the back room, went round to investigate and found that £5,000 in saving room be stolen. I see. Where do you live, son? 121 Halliwell Road, Dulwich, SE21. 121 Halliwell Road, Dulwich, SE21. Another Halliwell Road from my sergeant! I can't believe it. I thought the bloke had done that was put inside last year. Listen, Parkhurst! Well, it must have been somebody else. Thank you, Sergeant. We'll get things moving right away, sir. You take over here, Sergeant! No more fraudulence in the area. Come on, darling. I'm afraid I can't rain home this evening. Calling all squad cars in the area.
So I know it sounds silly, but that is really sometimes what it might feel like for some of our survivors, for our clients, to get what they need to get. Everybody's got different language. I know when I sit in meetings for homelessness, I use different words than when I sit in meetings when I use survivors, even if they're the same. When we work with DV, same clients. I know that's true for very different disciplines. So it's an exaggeration, but we wanted to get your attention. So when we're interviewing the client, technique is everything. How are we going to talk to them? Now, this is a hard one in COVID, but if you aren't in COVID, we really recommend a comfortable space, offering, some water, make sure it's a confidential space. I know, again, some things are limited during COVID. And how are we being the gatekeepers? Jess?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned regardless of where, if our clients are homeless or DV, and we code switch, we use different language. In reality, even though our systems and our programs are very much siloed, our clients are all of those things. When we look at the overlap between like substance use, domestic and sexual violence, homelessness, child abuse, like we look at these different things, there's a lot of overlap. And so from the client perspective, so if we go back to that intersectionality image, when we think about a client as a holistic person with lived experience that's coming in and all of these past traumas that they're coming to us, they're not coming to us as just a person experiencing homelessness. They're coming to us as a person who may have also experienced sexual assault, domestic violence, racism, homophobia, all of these other things. And they have learned that for each individual service, they have to take their identity down to just one. So today I am just the person experiencing homelessness. And I know when I'm interacting with a homeless advocate, I have to say words like XYZ to get me into permanent supportive housing, to get me into emergency shelter, to get me these different services. And so, in addition to that skit showing both of our ages, because Monty Python is a little more in the 70s, 80s, 60s, it's also really showing what we do to clients when they come in. And when I say we, I mean the health and human services sector as a whole. I don't just mean homeless providers, domestic violence providers. We all do this. We all have a language and we expect people to know that to get services. But then when they come in and have all the answers and use all the right words, then we turn around and say, they're gaming the system. They knew exactly what to say.
Next slide. So how do we change that? First, we acknowledge this has to be really hard. Nobody wants to meet with me today. Make it light, make it a joke. I'm not always everybody's favorite interview, but I'm going to do what I can to help you. Be a person, facilitate the client's comfort. One of the most important things you can do is restore some sense of control. At any point, you can ask me why I'm asking these questions. And I've even said, sometimes I have to ask these questions because funding requires it and I'm asking you, but I completely understand that they may not make as much sense as we would like. Be empathetic, explain. So too often we don't explain what's happening. So I'm going to ask you some questions and we're going to see what we can do. And at the end, I will definitely get you referrals if we're not able to place you, but I promise that there's a purpose to some of these questions. And if they have questions and concerns, like what is confidential and what isn't, be honest. If they report child abuse, you should tell them up front that you're a mandatory reporter if you're a mandatory reporter. Nothing should be a secret. If clients just have questions and concerns of like, I'm super cold, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What can I do to make you warmer? Would you like some hot tea? Would you like me to turn up the heat in my office if that's possible? I've worked in places where it's impossible. But, you know, or you can even just say, yeah, our office is always really cold and I'm sorry about that, because some of you have that situation going on. But don't ignore it. Jess?
I think this opening is a really important time. It sets the stage for everything else you say. The initial intake kind of creates this lens that that client is going to view you and your organization through moving forward from there. Even the way that we introduce ourselves, you know, you notice at the beginning, Sarah and I introduce ourselves using our pronouns. A lot of what happens when folks, particularly trans folks come in, trans folks make up a lot of the homeless population because of societal issues around that. Yet that isn't something that we are often well trained on or comfortable with individually. Using the name that people prefer to be called, and really understanding what part of this intake do I absolutely, as an advocate, do I absolutely have to have in order to get funded for giving services to this person, and what things are kind of extra. So as somebody, I'm a nerd, I love data, I'm an evaluator. When I was working in homeless services, there were so many questions, so much data that as the executive director, I wanted to have, because I wanted to know just all of these things. And I wanted to know how the staff were doing and all of this stuff, right? That's things that I wanted. It's not things that had to happen in order for that person to receive services. It's shocking when we actually tear apart our intake forms and go funding source by funding source, exactly what things we actually need to know versus what is left over on our forms from funding we had 10 years ago, or what are things we just sort of like to know. If you're a data geek like me, you can try to pare that down to as little as possible, because these questions are traumatizing. Like that little role play that Sarah and I did, a lot of those questions we don't really need to know, or we don't need to know in that initial meeting.
Thank you. And I would like to echo the just simple things like introducing your pronouns can create a safer space. It lets you know that you're aware that some folks' pronouns may not match societal understanding of gender identity expression. So it's a very simple way to be more trauma informed.
And asking people how they'd like to be addressed. If I know a lot of times clients come in without formal paperwork or ID, but if they do, their name that they use every day may not match the name on their formal ID. And that's something that can make or break a relationship from the beginning.
And if you have to use their birth name, tell them, I have to use the birth name on this form, but I understand that that's not who you are. And make sure you say, you know, but I'm happy to call you this. I'm sorry, the state hasn't caught up to where we should be. Next slide.
Alice, you can just put them all on one slide. Thank you.
So make sure the immediate needs are met. So I'm a huge fan of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like when I ran a homeless shelter and we were also the HARA, my wonderful in-laws donated granola bars and waters every week just to make sure that folks had something to eat before we started asking them questions. You can't always make sure there's a shower. We were able to, you know, have a shower at our spot, but it was a work in progress. If you have change of clothes, if you are serve women or folks who have a period, make sure that you have menstrual products. Those are things that normally churches will donate. If you tell them, I need lots and lots of menstrual products, that is something you can ask for donations. You know, lots of times kiddos are there. So I would make sure that there was coloring books and crayons. And again, those granola bars were important for the kiddos. It's exhausting to be homelessness. Lots of folks ride the bus with their kids or, you know, have nowhere to go. Even if you can't get them sleep, you can get them rest. while they're waiting to meet with you. Make your space as positive as possible. And those donations, everything we did as Sahara, they were all community donations. The one-time donation and then the ongoing donation of like food and water, it's very tangible and something that you can get communities to get behind. Watch your own body language. I know I have to always watch for fatigue. If you're pulling a long day, you have to watch that you're shutting down. And if you're tired, be honest. Be like, I am really tired and this is not you, but I'm into what you're doing. Because people understand just because they're homeless, it's actually better not to other them. They know what it's like to be tired. And you're like, look, I'm paying attention. I just also have had a long day and I want to make sure that I'm able to spend time with you. And I just want you to not read that as anything else. Take breaks and use the client's words describing their experiences and clarify what the words mean. There's a lot of words, as I am in my mid 40s, that even my 19 and 22-year-old use, that I'm like, please explain to me what that word means. I do not know. Today, my daughter kept telling me everything I did was sus. And I was like, what? And she's like, suspicious. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know why it was suspicious. I didn't have time. We're on our way to school. But and I also have a 9-year-old. It's not just that. Seniors also, you have to clarify what words are being used. Some of the biggest miscommunications happen here, where we assume one word means something, but it does not. Jess?
Yeah, next slide, please, Allison. So this is something that I also was super guilty at when I first started. And again, it goes back to the way that I was not trauma informed. I had a list of things that I needed to get answers to. And this is not just with clients, but with staff, supervisees as well. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how creating a trauma-informed organization is not just our interaction with clients, but it's the totality of the organization. I was famous for, if Sarah is the client and I ask a question and instead of answering the question, she's telling a story about something else, kind of interrupting, being like, okay, but what I really need to know right now is XYZ. Interrupting during this intake, during any of the conversations or interactions we have with clients, completely destroys the conversation. It breaks down trust, makes people feel like we're not listening. What they have to say is important. And one of the things, so Allison, if you move to the next slide, one of the things we're going to talk about when we're talking about how to do these intakes is by definition, the nature of trauma and the way trauma affects our brain makes it really, really difficult to tell a story in a linear chronological fashion. As the advocate, that's what I want, right? Is a linear chronological fashion so I can fill out the form, do the VI SPDAT, prioritize, get someone to housing, get someone into a program, and then start working with them. Trauma doesn't work that way. Things come out in really weird circular ways. Big parts of the story are left out. Parts are, they come back later. There's missing and inconsistent information. What's really one of the biggest things that I always take away from that clip that we watched by Dr. Campbell is when she said that trauma causes information to be stored in the wrong files and in incomplete sections. And so even though the story comes out, circular pieces are missing, it comes out sounding weird, the information is true. So the way that trauma stores memories does not change the
Accuracy of the memory.
Thank you. Does not change the accuracy of the memory.
And you might be saying at this point, but I have to get through this interview with this client. We have actually found that this allowing someone to tell their own story actually gets you better data in a shorter period of time. It's just a little bit about surrender. So if Jessica wants to tell me all about her cat and how about her cat needed medicine, you will often find out that the cat needing medicine was also part of the day that her perpetrator, the victim's perpetrator, kicked her in the head and threw her out, and she can't find her cat who needs medicine. It is connected. And by validating and hearing the story, you not only are trauma informed, you're going to get vital details you wouldn't get otherwise.
For the cat, starting with the story of the cat needing medicine, even though it's not answering the question that we asked, sometimes what happens is then it goes to, but then I couldn't get to the vet because my car wouldn't start, and it's leading down this path as to how this person ended up being housing insecure. And so by letting the client, starting with an open-ended question, and by letting the client tell that story, in our mind, we can be taking notes that, okay, so we have healthcare issues, we have a pet that might need housing while this person is in shelter, we have transportation issues. Like we're actually going through the checklist that we need just by listening to this narrative. And then we can start with that probing. Tell me a little bit more about, and then we learn more about the transportation issues, the employment issues, all of these other things that are linked to the homelessness that are really important to know in order to provide services, instead of having to just ask a question with a succinct answer, followed by a question with a succinct answer. Because people want to tell their story oftentimes. And so again, this was me and my mistakes. I didn't want to ask an open-ended question because then it started a 10-minute story about stuff. But that 10-minute story about stuff actually covers, 15 of the questions I need to have answered. And it feels more, it's trauma informed. It feels more comfortable. It feels less than like a ping pong interview where somebody is just demanding information out of a person. Allison?
So if you have the luxury of having more than one intake, you build rapport after that, see if they can share more. It might all be one interview, it may be two. We encourage two, but that's not always possible with the funding everyone gets. You get a deeper understanding of who people's lived experience. I think we can go to the next one.
Yeah, what I find in this, so in the organization that I worked with, it wasn't a multi-stage interview, it was just the first intake. But instead of multi-interviews, it was just every other conversation we had with the client after that. You learn more information, and it was really common for the case manager to come back and say, well, today I learned this, and this probably qualifies them for one of our other programs. And so we were able to move clients around to better suit their needs.
So the difference between an experiential intake versus a chronological intake, an experiential is trauma informed, is instead of reducing a three-dimensional experience to a two-dimensional who, what, where, and when, and why. And I learned that as a kiddo as to how to write my essays, right? Who, what, when, where, why. We actually look at this as someone's lived experience. And in that way, it doesn't diminish the experience, and it doesn't diminish the quality of information we get. So we look at experiential interviews. So when we do reduce three-dimensional interviews to two-dimensional, the advocate may have trouble understanding or believing the narrative. The client doesn't give a full explanation, and client isn't housing inappropriate, is housed inappropriately, and housing supports can fail because you're not getting the entirety of a three-dimensional lived experience. Next slide. So what does an experiential intake look like? And so you use more open-ended questions. You focus on the client's experience, and you allow clients to relate their information in this way that's natural to trauma, to the ways in which it may be stored in the wrong spots in the brain. So it has a ripple effect not a chronological timeline. So you follow the client's train of thought, and that requires you to step back from the control. When I taught law students, this was the hardest thing because they wanted to control the interview. You don't have to. You can guide and gently direct the interview. Jess?
Type A folks like myself, Sarah, are very similar to probably teaching law students. What I love about this image that's on here, this ripple effect, is, during intakes, clients are often throwing out little pieces of information, like little pebbles into the pond. And we have to understand that they're connected to other issues. And so when we're doing that intake, I like to encourage people to you can have the intake form with you, but not use it necessarily. Just know what information you need to get and then have a conversation. So it's like when you're putting together a puzzle. That's how trauma works, right? When you're putting together a puzzle, you might see, here's a piece of the blue sky, so I know it goes over here. Here's a piece of the wagon, so I know it goes over here. And as the caseworker, our job is to kind of watch the client give us puzzle pieces, and we're making little notes of it. And then we can come back and ask for more information and then try to fit that into the intake questions instead of just doing one question after another. Allison? So these are just some examples of different types of words, different types of questions we can ask that are more trauma informed and elicit more of a narrative that will actually give us the answers to the questions we need without necessarily asking the questions. So, what can you tell me about your experience? Tell me more about this. What else can you remember about that? Help me understand, Allison. You can ask things like, when you were experiencing that, tell me about, like, what were you thinking about? How were you feeling? A big part of experiential interviewing is the 5 senses. This is really important when individuals have experienced trauma, as homelessness is trauma, right? We don't always remember in this chronological way what the story is. But if Sarah's talking to me and asking me, like, how are you feeling? What did you see? What were you thinking about? And engaging those 5 senses, we can get a lot more information than we would otherwise. The third question on here, though, what was the most difficult part of your experience? This to me is often like where the money's at. A lot of times, the thing that is really like if you ask a client, like, what is the one thing you think you need to resolve your experience with homelessness or whatever you're talking about, it might be something that as a caseworker, I never would have thought of, but it can say so much. And then it opens up the door to all of the other services that we provide other than the rapid rehoming project or program or whatever program we're trying to get them into. It can open up a host of other programs like, oh yeah, we actually do this and this, and we have this service. And we can provide more robust services when we ask people these open-ended questions.
And I just want to highlight, it might have nothing to do with their current homelessness. It could be, fees and fines from a misdemeanor 10 years ago that generated a bench warrant, which means they can't get a variety of different resources, but you find out it's like $300. And you could have the community support raising that money. And it opens up a whole range of options if the warrant's dropped. There are all kinds of unexpected consequences that things that can create homelessness. Now, I think it's an excellent question of what do you do if you don't have the funds they need? The question then is, how can you work with your community to develop the funds? And sometimes the answer is you don't have it, but then you're at least getting information about the next grant you need to write or the next thing you need to advocate for. Because one of the things we need to acknowledge is there are going to be times in our work is heartbreaking that we can't solve everything. But acknowledging it, like, I hear you, that is a really terrible barrier in the system. Vital records can be a big one, right? Even though you can get them for free, there's some challenges about not getting them online. those are really challenging things. Let me, if it's okay with you, let me start keeping a list and so we can help other people. At the very least, people want to know their experiences matter. And you can inform places like MCAH of these kind of patterns and traits so that we can look for ways to get those dollars. So that you're both dealing with the micro and the macro, because I hear you. Sometimes there's no money. Sometimes you have to you can get money on this one-off, but that doesn't mean the next person you can find the money. And I want to acknowledge how hard that is. But I also want to say that you're not alone. There's a community of folks who are looking for ways to track these patterns and trends so we can look at ways to get both government and private foundation interventions.
Yeah, when I hear a question like that, so I go in a similar direction. So Allison, if you can move to the next slide, we're going to start talking about what are the things necessary to transform your organization into an organization that is doing trauma-informed care. And so we've already alluded a little bit to the fact that a trauma-informed organization is so much more than serving the client right in front of you. Now, that's a big part of it, and that's what we've talked about so far. But being trauma-informed also means that we're caring for ourselves, our staff, our coworkers, our supervisees, and it also means we're doing systems change work. And so that question, what happens if we can't meet the need of a client? So on the one hand, as a caseworker, that feels terrible. When the person is sitting in front of you that needs help and you have nothing. And so part of being a trauma-informed organization is, how do you then support that caseworker or advocate in having a healthy response to this really emotional, traumatic experience that that person can't help with. And then our other role is, if we don't have funds for it and other systems that we are working with have a negative response to it. So if we use that example of having a warrant or a criminal history, we all know that there are a lot of other systems that the clients we work with are engaging with that shuts the door immediately. And so then the other part of being trauma-informed is systems change. So when we think about shifting our organization to become more trauma-informed, what we recommend is that we first start with an organizational assessment. And so we want to have a real, honest, critical dialogue about how ready our organization is to make this cultural shift. What are the organizational components that we're already doing, that we're doing well, that we have never thought of, that we know we're supposed to do, but we just haven't? Because let's face it, there's no time, there's no money, there's no resources, we're all understaffed, there's lack of training, there's all of these issues that we face in nonprofit. And so how realistic is this, and what tools do we need to put in place in order to do it? How do we engage our staff? How do we engage the people we're providing services to? And how do we engage our community? Next slide. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to spend the next 20 or so minutes talking about. Again, trauma-informed care. So it is, what are we doing with staff and understanding that? How are we integrating intersectionality? How are we understanding that trauma is a universal human experience, and that the folks that are coming to us for services in homelessness are most likely, I'm not even saying most likely, are definitely experiencing trauma in other aspects of their lives because of the identities they hold. Experiencing trauma through disability, mental health, substance use, racism, domestic and sexual violence. Think about how we're going to learn to recognize symptoms and signs of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue. Because in order to engage in a trauma-informed manner with the clients we're serving, we also have to be trauma-informed ourselves as employees and with our coworkers and with our supervisees. And then how do we create a full a full organizational culture that embraces this. So through actual policies, how do we enforce time off and vacation? How do we support staff in getting mental health? As a supervisor, how do I support the person that I'm supervising in order to make sure that they are taking care of themselves and recognizing signs and symptoms of trauma? Folks that engage in this kind of work, and it doesn't matter what type of system you're involved in. So if you are, I saw in the intro, there are some folks that are working in criminal justice, probation, domestic and sexual violence organizations, homeless organizations. It doesn't matter what system we're involved in. Doing this work can be traumatic for us as workers. So it can cause secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. We are very susceptible to burnout and compassion fatigue. And so we really need to have an organization that supports just the philosophical idea that that is a real thing. So the question that was in the chat a minute ago, let's say I have a caseworker that I work with that is, this is true experience. So as the executive director, I didn't sit across the table from a lot of our clients, but the caseworkers that worked for the organization did. And so sitting across from a family that is dealing with homelessness, that is traumatized, that has needs, and that caseworker has to say no, or I don't know, or I can't help you. We don't have the funding for that. That is a real, that emotional reaction for that caseworker is real. The way that feels is real. I would hope that folks doing this work don't just have a response of like, we can't help you, who cares, bye. That's not the reality. So vicarious trauma that our staff and advocates experience is very real. If we're not caring for our staff, those staff cannot provide trauma-informed services to the clients that walk through the door. It just can't happen. Allison, if you can split 2 slides, please. Yep, go to the next one. Excellent, thank you. So a couple of things we talk about are, creating a safe and supportive environment. And again, as we go through each one of these concepts, I'm not just talking about a safe and supportive environment for clients, but also for our coworkers and colleagues. A lot of times we're really good at creating a safe physical environment. An area that we need to pay a little more attention to is to creating a safe emotional environment. And so these are things like respecting people's pronouns and their chosen name, respecting spiritual practices, being culturally humble, and understanding, having an understanding of intersectionality. So another thing that we know about trauma is individuals' identities and lived experiences impact 3 different things. So they impact opportunities to be traumatized, right? So it may increase someone's opportunities to experience trauma. It can influence the way that an individual experiences and makes meaning of that trauma and processes the trauma. And I don't mean that chemical dump that Dr. Campbell was talking about, because that's universal. What I'm talking about is how we psychologically make meaning of the traumatic experience. And those identities also influence how we may heal from trauma. And so when folks come into our organization or come into shelter and they use different words, they talk about trauma differently, they have different emotional responses, and they need different things from us to heal, those aren't judgments that we make of them, right? We want to make sure that we're really open, honest, and transparent. And I put on here, use true informed consent. So when we talk about informed consent in a trauma-informed way, it's much more than just signing the HIPAA line or, you know, what we're used to doing. It really means by answering this question, these are the implications. By engaging in this program, you might experience secondary trauma. Being really open and honest about what a client is signing up for. Confidentiality and privacy. One of our dear colleagues talks about confidentiality as being our superpower. So whatever sector we work in, confidentiality is something that we can offer in a way that's very different from what clients may be experiencing in other organizations, or if they're working with criminal justice, for example. And when I say confidentiality and privacy, that extends that, although technically it extends throughout our whole organization, it's a very need to know basis. So when I like to use the example of when you go to the doctor's office, if you're going to your gynecologist with an issue that you don't necessarily want to broadcast, technically confidentiality extends throughout the whole organization. But do you really want the receptionist and the maintenance person talking about what they overheard in the doctor's office, or the receptionist gets a lot of personal information from you. It isn't necessarily their business. You don't want them talking about it to other staff, even though the confidentiality may extend throughout the organization. We talk about safety plans a lot, and this is something that we don't find as often in strictly homeless organizations. A lot of times we see it more in like a domestic violence organization, but safety optioning and planning is for clients, but also for staff. One of the things that we're going to send out to you afterwards is emergency and a long-term safety planning form that we really encourage you to fill out to help ward against vicarious and secondary trauma. But safety planning is also something that we want to be constantly doing with clients. It's not a one-time event. It's not a checklist. It's not something we just do during intake or the first time that person meets with the case manager, but it's during every conversation that we have with clients. We're talking about physical and emotional safety. And then of course, we talk about respect, dignity. So we like to say that, within an organization, every time we're talking about a person that we are providing services to, we're talking about them in a way that if they were to overhear the conversation, we would be proud of what we're saying. One of the things that I noticed as a red flag for trauma affecting staff is when caseworkers and other staff start talking about clients in a disrespectful, undignified ways, or using words like, gaming the system, taking advantage, manipulating, frequent flyer. When we start hearing those kind of words, that's a red flag that we are becoming traumatized by witnessing other people's trauma. We're taking that trauma on. And that is kind of a sign that we're on the road to burnout and compassion fatigue. We talked a lot already about trauma-informed intake and how we can really critically look at that. I always encourage organizations to literally go through every piece of paper that they either give to a client or that they use to ask questions. Every single question, go line by line, and make sure that we know why it's being asked, what we're doing with the information and where it goes, what its purpose is, and if it's really necessary. One of the things that I found in a couple different organizations I was working with is when we went through line by line, and this isn't something that one person does, this is the team that does this. When we went through line by line, there were a lot of things in the paperwork and in the intake that were literally from grants that were like closed out 10 years ago. So at one point we needed this information and used it. We don't really need it anymore, but it's still on the intake just because this isn't intentional or insidious. It's just, we know what it's like to work in these nonprofits. There's never enough time or resources, right? And so these are the things that get pushed to the side when we're dealing with crisis every day. But a lot of times we are asking these questions of clients that we don't actually need to know. Or something, again, I'm guilty of, we ask the questions of clients because you have an executive director, for example, me, who just likes data and wants to know this stuff, but you don't actually need to ask that. And it can be really invasive or it can re-traumatize clients. And so having real honest conversations around, do I really need to know this? And am I actually using it? Or is it just going in a database or a file folder somewhere? If it's something that a funder actually needs, or a funder says they need, that can be a conversation that you also have with the funder. So part of systems change work is also how we engage with funders to help our funders be more trauma informed. When we look at rules, policies, and procedures, so this is another thing, this can be really touchy for organizations and for staff. When we are moving an organization to be more trauma informed, people get really comfortable in the way we've always done things. Or, you know, we tried that once 10 years ago and it didn't work. We've already tried that. When we look at the way that we set up our organizations, we want to make sure that we have a process, a regular process for review of rules, policies, and procedures, and make sure that we are doing we're having these in a way that is trauma informed, that's intersectional, and it's a team of people that are reviewing these policies on a regular basis. And we want to make sure that clients, consumers, survivors, whatever we call the people that we're in service to, and whoever we are providing those services to, are involved at every step in the way in this behind the scenes organizational management of designing programs, establishing policies and procedures, reviewing policies and procedures. We want to make sure that clients are involved in that. And that can look a host of different ways. We can have folks on staff that have previously experienced homelessness. We can have volunteers, board members. We can do evaluations that involve clients in the creation of those evaluations and what you do with that information when you get that data back. And that is a whole separate training that we provide on how to do trauma-informed evaluation. But that's something that's really critical in moving the organization into this trauma-informed space. Allison? Oh, excellent. Something else we want to touch on is community, how we engage community. So we've already talked a little bit about systems change, and that's one of the ways that community is involved in becoming trauma-informed, because it doesn't stop with the client. It doesn't stop with our organization even. It also involves doing systems change work with all of our community partners that the clients we serve interact with. So we all know folks experiencing homelessness a lot of times are involved in the court system, in bankruptcy, losing their homes, substance use, mental health, maybe working with a domestic violence organization. They're involved in all these different systems. And so as we are moving to be more trauma informed, sometimes that can further us from the way that our community partners do their work. And so we want to be educating those partners to become more trauma informed as well. And that's really how becoming trauma informed as an individual organization can be part of the greater goal of ending homelessness. Another reason we want to make sure we are really having a pulse on community is because as your organization is changing, you can get some pushback or misunderstanding from community partners. And so we want to make sure we know how our community is going to respond to the changes within our organization as well. Allison? So finally, we want to just touch on what do we do when we're talking about planning to become more trauma informed and then sustaining this, right? And so we talk about like setting the table or setting the stage. We want to make sure that we're working with our full team, including clients, and that this spans all of the staff in the organization. So it is not just the advocates or case managers or the leadership team. It's maintenance staff, receptionists, volunteers, everyone in the organization. We need to get buy-in from them. If you have had the experience of trying to create culture change within an organization without first doing this work, it can really fail. It can really blow up in your face. I have lots of stories about me doing that, trying to create culture change and not setting the stage well or getting buy-in and not involving all of the staff that need to be involved, but trying to do it myself. That is not a trauma-informed way or a good way to do that. And I keep talking about culture change. When we're moving to being trauma-informed, it is culture change. It isn't just about changing the way we do intakes and interact with survivors or changing a policy. It is a complete mind shift within the organization. And culture change is difficult. It is really slow and it's not linear. It's like, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, and there's backlash sometimes. So when we are going through this process, we want to make sure that we're involving our staff, we're taking care of our staff, and we're doing evaluation throughout this process. So we know what we're doing well and where we're still having challenges. So at the end of the day, kind of what some of the gauges for trauma informed and kind of how far we're coming along that continuum is when all of the staff within the organization start to be able to recognize homelessness as trauma in and of itself and recognize that the people that we're serving in the present are reacting to past experiences. When staff start responding differently to clients based on this knowledge of trauma and interacting differently with them. When our regular supervision of staff includes conversations about staff understanding and recognizing their own triggers and symptoms of vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. Because again, a staff who is experiencing trauma cannot provide trauma-informed care to a person experiencing homelessness. When a program is providing ongoing and regular training around trauma. When organizations have formal ways to support staff. So self-care discussions in all staff meetings and supervisory meetings, education about work-related trauma, procedures and opportunities to debrief after client intakes. So when a case manager finishes with a client when they have to say, no, I can't help you. How do we support that staff and debrief with them afterwards? How do we fund as an organization self-care, like PTO, sick time, mental health coverage, things like that? When staff are using strength-based and empowering language to talk about clients, and when we're recognizing resiliency and strength that clients are bringing with them through all of their lived experiences and identities, and when the organization is really honestly providing clients feedback, including client feedback in the design of programs, the implementation of the program, and the evaluation of it. Sarah, do you have anything to add on that before we close for some questions?
I don't. I want to leave some space for, I know we have very little space, so I would love your thoughts and questions in the last few minutes, because I think we've covered a lot, and I do want to sort of lift up those of you who are brave enough to talk into the chat about the ways in which vicarious trauma is already affecting you. That's really normal. We've put some resources in the chat and really encourage you to look at what you need, and then understand that you can't do it alone, that there has to be organizational change. I think my loneliest point in this work was thinking there was something wrong with me, rather than normalizing the fact that we deal with really hard stuff and that creates its own traumatic response.
Thanks, Sarah. I also put into the chat our statewide hotline. So this is a statewide hotline. It's specifically, I mean, it's originally for sexual assault survivors, but it's also for advocates and caseworkers that are working with survivors. And even though this audience is primarily homeless service providers, we all know that homelessness and sexual and domestic violence overlap at a strikingly high rate. And so this is also a resource for all of you as advocates. You can call the hotline as well and get some support on vicarious and secondary trauma. You do not have to say that you're an advocate. You don't have to say you were in this training. You don't have to give any details. You can just say you're reaching out for support on trauma. And the staff are really knowledgeable and can suggest some things for you or send you some additional resources. So Allison, if you can move to the last slide, we do have our, Sarah and I have our emails on here. You are also welcome to call us at the office anytime. We're still working remotely, but we do have it forwarded to our home phones. And that is, Sarah, help me, 1517-347-7000?
Correct.
All right, I'm gonna put that into. As a result of working in our high-tech world, I don't know numbers anymore. I just look in my phone.
Okay, well, we still have a minute. If people have questions, please put them into the chat. But while we wait, I just wanted to make sure that I once again thank all of you for giving the time today to come and learn about this important topic and how you can support your clients and yourself better. I put the link for Micah's YouTube channel in the chat. We hope to have this recording up within a week. I want to thank Jessica and Sarah for providing their expertise and their time to Micah so we could provide this to all of you. So thank you so much. And then I wanted to let folks know that Micah is a membership-based organization. So the way that we're able to plan and provide these trainings every month, so we have at least one free training a month. This month, there'll be 3, is through membership. So if you want to join to be a member, the links are in the chat. Our next training is next Monday. It's on how to use the annual report for advocacy. So we hope to see you then. Sarah or Jessica, do you have anything else before we adjourn?
I just want to add to Carol, I'm sorry that that happened. We want you to stay in this work. It shouldn't cost you 11 days in the hospital. And so vicarious trauma is, as well as trauma-informed care for everyone, is treating our clients with dignity and respect, as well as you with dignity, respect, and understanding that trauma is part of the human condition, and we can do better by our clients and better by each other. So I really challenge folks to take this back, take it to leadership, and really think about how we can do this differently. We're also available with Micah to provide any other follow-up trainings that might be useful. The coalition is here to support, Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence is here to support Micah. So if there's anything that you might want us to present on, please let them know, because we enjoy this partnership, because we truly believe that this is a combined effort to help folks out of poverty, to end domestic and sexual violence, and make sure folks become and have a right to housing.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes. Thank you. And I hope that you are able to enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.